Hello, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable plenary discussion about activism and journalism in relation to politics and democracy. Hopefully, it'll be, since you're all here, we know it's a very timely topic, and hopefully it'll be a fruitful discussion. I'll start by introducing myself, and then my fellow the panelists, my fellow panelists. My name is Dr. Omar Al-Ghazi. I'm an assistant professor at the Media and Communication Department at LSE across the road. My research interests, part of my research interests is in relation to media practices in the Arab world since 2011, thinking about activism, war, media practices, journalism. So I guess that's why I'm moderating the session. I'll briefly introduce panelists because you can find their full bios in the program. First, my colleague Shepard Mpofu. He completed his master's in film and television and a PhD in media studies from the University of Witwatersrand. Is that, I probably butchered it. He currently teaches at the University of Limpopo. His research focuses on questions of citizen journalism and voice in Zimbabwe. To my right, Burcu Karakaş is a Turkish journalist who worked as a correspondent and contributor for several media outlets, including Deutsche Welle, Milliyet, and several independent Turkish online platforms. She has completed a master's in journalism at Boston University as well. To my left is Sharat Peer, who is a Kashmiri journalist, scriptwriter, author, political commentator. He is currently based in New York City and is the opinion editor at the New York Times International. He is also a fellow of the Open Society Institute in New York. Francis L.F. Lee is a professor at the School of Journalism and Communication in the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His recent publications include Talk Radio, the Mainstream Press, and Public Opinion in Hong Kong. And another one is Communication, Public Opinion, and Globalization in Urban China. His research interests include press freedom and political change, media and collective memory of political events. And finally, Anjan Sundaram, who unfortunately could not physically be here with us, but he will be speaking on Skype. He is the author of, yes, he is the author of Bad News, Last Journalists in a Dictatorship, and also Stringer, A Reporter's Journey in the Congo. His journalism has been awarded a Frontline Club Prize and a Reuters Prize, and he has been shortlisted for the Prix Bayeux. He holds a PhD in journalism and creative writing from the University of East Anglia. So we'll start off the kind of structure of the panel will be more on the informal side of having a discussion, and then at the end we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I will start with you, Shepard, but the question is open to everyone. Since we have both journalists and academics, I want to ask in your work, and whether it's in research or in your own experience, how do the roles of journalism and activism interact?
Okay, thanks very much, Omar. And I'd like to thank Pierre and Tim for inviting me to this conference. I want to show some slides. Maybe my fellow panelists might need to move a bit so that they can see them or just swivel around. What I want to talk about is issues of journalism and democracy, especially considering the title of the panel. And my main argument is that journalism and democracy do not have sacred definitions. They are slippery concepts, and even the identity of a journalist is slippery itself. Unlike that of a lawyer, for you to be admitted into the bar, you have to have a law degree. but not necessarily so for journalists. You can be a medical doctor and be a medical journalist for a publication or something like that. And also the interference of new media into our lives has actually changed the definition of journalism. So my main worry and area of research has been on identity, on violence, protests, and the like. So I was interested and fascinated about the Zimbabwe genocide, of which I'm in a way a victim, and also how this issue 28 years, or I can't even remember how old Zimbabwe is, 20-something years after the genocide happened, it has never been discussed. And it so happened that one day an artist who is also a victim like myself, this is the Bulawayo Art Gallery. I think Haynes might know it. You were in Bulawayo at once, right? Where is Haynes? I think you might know it. So this is an art gallery in Bulawayo. So early in the morning, people woke up to a genocide exhibition. That is what it was later called, Okukra Hundi exhibition. And the artist had drawn images of the violence that happened in the 1980s. And this happened in 2010. So for 4 hours, the people in the morning were confronted with that. And then immediately, the government got to know about it. And somebody told the gallery, the curator and the manager of the gallery to close that thing up. And strangely, they used state-controlled newspapers to blockade the windows of the gallery so that people do not see. And that thing stayed there for about 5 years because the artist had to go to court. And my main argument with this, my main worry about the definition of journalism, or journalism having no cyclic definition, was, could this guy be a journalist? Is he a public intellectual? Is he an activist? Considering the fact that most of the mainstream media journalists in Zimbabwe do not confront, especially those who are employed by the public media, do not confront the excesses of government. And the silences about the genocide that happened 20-something years ago, which has still not been discussed and still remains a taboo. It was poignant that somebody actually decided to confront that, but only for 4 hours. So this is one of the images at the end of the genocide. So 22 December, Zimbabwe celebrates what they call Unity Day, which Unity Day was the end of the genocide. And you see there's a signing ceremony. I guess most of you notice who the man on the left is, to your left. Do you? Huh? That looks like Mugabe, right? But the artist refuses. He says he cannot interpret his work, so it's up to us. And then that is Joshua Nkomo, the leader of the opposition, whose people or main supporters and ethnic group were killed, in excess of 20,000. And the signing of the genocide marked what Zimbabwe calls the Unity Day. So during the Unity Day celebrations, mainstream state newspapers, that is, they ran stories about how the conflict was ended, but we're never told of what kind of a conflict was it. It's almost like a birthday celebration we have in our typical societies. We're never told of how we were conceived, right? But we're told we were born. So the genocide or the Unity Day, we're never told what happened that led to the Unity Day. We're only told we have a Unity Day. So it confronts the Unity Day from that perspective that it hasn't been addressed, and addressing it remains a taboo. So that's the signing, and you can see the guy in the middle, Joshua Nkomo, signing it almost under duress. And then this is part of the violence that happened. So this is male genitalia. It's depicting what used to happen. People, especially men, were accused of being dissidents. Their genitalia bent or squeezed with what you call Oh, the weight is running away from me. But nonetheless, and then also we had people being burnt in their houses. So that's the inscription there, that they burnt my brother in their house. And then also, when after farming, especially corn, you put it in a wooden sort of container, and then you crush it to separate the corn, the chaff from the corn. And then this person was asked to, this is what the artist experienced. Somebody was asked to put their baby in that container and crush them, right? So this is what he was depicting during that. And then there's a last one, last image, I don't know why I didn't pick it up, where people were hung upside down to die a slow death. So in your community, they were hanging you on a tree with your feet up and your head down. And my grandmother tells me that during that time, actually somebody's tongue will come out. You know, it will get huge and come out, and then you die slowly as a way of notifying or terrifying the people who are watching, or potential terrorists. So what I'm looking at here is in a context where journalists abrogate their right or their duties to actually be activists, to speak about issues of concern in society, artists play an almost better role in that regard. You find that in Zimbabwe you have constitutionally provided freedoms of the press and expression, but they are not practiced to the full, because after that kind of expression, you are not guaranteed your freedom. You might have the freedom before, but thereafter it's not guaranteed. And also, one of the most important things is that the public-owned but state-controlled media play an almost public relations role for ZANU-PF. And therefore, they do not confront these kinds of issues. And our journalists in that media cannot lay claim to the charge that they are activists or they are fighters for democracy or whatever it is.
Okay, thank you very much for this initial account, and we can begin to appreciate how complicated the differentiation between journalism and activism is, particularly in contexts that where there's extreme violence and dictatorship. So we will touch on these themes as we go along. Burcu, I'm wondering, in your experience as a journalist covering Turkey, how does that interaction between journalism and activism work?
How much time do I have? This is counting down. So thanks for the invitation, first of all. This may be the first invitation I got, and I'm not going to talk about the press freedom in Turkey, but rather about activism, I guess. But of course, I just want to mention some numbers, and I'm also quite sure that you're familiar what is going about in Turkey about the press freedom and media. But just in short, right now, I mean, the numbers are changing, but it's about 180 journalists in jail in Turkey. And so, and there just recently new regulations has been imposed on the internet, and this is also going to affect the websites, the online platforms in general in Turkey, which was also a nightmare. For instance, I'm writing for the Deutsche Welle Turkish. It's a website, and the government can ban this website anytime they want, if they want to. Maybe these images, or like BBC Turkish, and the online platforms. And these are important just because the government is mostly dominated by the not dominated, but I may say after the Doğan Media Group was also sold to a pro-government group. Right now, we cannot talk about any even mainstream media, leaving aside the independent media. I mean, of course, we have the independent media, but they have rather really little economic source, so it's a problem. So I'm just giving this example to, I mean, journalism and activism, yes, it's an important topic, but we are trying to, of course, deal with this kind of issues right now in Turkey. So I want to give an example for the trials. Like, as a journalist, as a reporter, I have been following the journalist trials for so long now. And when we, of course, we go to the courts and we follow these trials, most of the people that are in jail, they are our colleagues, they are our friends. And so where does the activism and the journalism stand there? So this is the thing, like, let's say when I'm writing an article about the Cumhuriyet trial in Turkey, we have these hashtags, actually the citizens, they are using the ordinary people, that when they use their social media accounts, they use these hashtags. But then we also, as the journalist, every time that I share a post, like, about one of these trials, I also intend to, I also use this hashtag. So I think, maybe this is like just only one example. Like, I mean, when your friend's in jail and when also you are following the trials at the same time, you are a journalist, you are a reporter following the trial, but at the same time you are trying to get your friends out of the jail. So, this is the thing that you most of the time we confront. And, or like, I can also give this example for the Kurdish journalists. Of course, this is not something new. As you know, we are having this Kurdish problem in Turkey for so long, and it's something that we cannot solve. And it's just getting worse, actually, every day right now. So we have our colleagues in the Kurdish cities in Turkey, and let's say I can just give you this example again, like during the curfews in Turkey in the 3 years ago. So just imagine that one Kurdish journalist, he or she is trying to cover she's trying to cover what's going on in their hometown, and like they are actually trying to write reports about their homes, and like they're just getting news that their friends are killed, or maybe some of their family members are injured. So then this is also a completely different topic, actually. I mean, of course, this is not something particularly about Turkey, but in general, maybe like in the places where we see these times of clashes, it's, I think, as you just gave the example, it's also about that. Of course, we know that it is really difficult for them to cover when there is this clash between the state and the PKK. And then most of the journalists also we see in Turkey, in the past, it used to be only, most of them, it used to be the Kurdish journalists, but now just because the government, thanks to the government, they have extended the definition of a terrorist, so now everyone is a terrorist in Turkey, it's something else, but so they have been accused of being a terrorist member, I'm talking of the journalists, and so they have been sent to jail just because they have been covering the Kurdish problem, and they are trying to do it from a human rights perspective. And if you are, of course, trying to reveal the truth, it's always an act of terrorism, not of course in Turkey, but also in countries like Turkey, I guess. And I'll just give one more example, then we can move on, and then I can get maybe some questions. I think one of the turning points in the recent Turkish media history, Gezi Park protests, if you are familiar with that, there have been clashes at the Taksim Square at the heart of Istanbul. The police was attacking the citizens, and just because they were trying to save some trees in this area. But of course, then it turned to something else, and there have been some riots, I can say. So, like, I also criticize myself, when I think about this, and I feel ashamed of that. Just because people, we also as journalists, this is something really, because in Turkey, you always see the police is clashing with the citizens, like in the Kurdish region, but it was relatively something new to see that at the heart of the city like Istanbul. And so people were shocked when the mainstream media, they saw that they weren't covering this attacks of the police like in the middle of the city. Actually, it wasn't something new. This was happening for years in Turkey, but at least this was something new for the middle class, I may say, that are living in Istanbul. So, of course, the journalists, we were like, what's happening? You are trying to understand, what's going on. And then I remember some of our friends, my colleagues, like, let's say, I think we missed that, there is a thin line between an activist and a journalist, and maybe not a thin line, but I think some of us has missed that. Like, we were writing, the police is coming from, I don't know, let's say, from this district, so be careful. But this is not a tweet that a journalist should write, I guess. But then that's the same person was actually covering something about then the protests, and then he or she was writing an article about that. But when you check the social media, activity of the journalist. You know, it is like, okay, you have just written something like this, and then you have actually reported about that. I don't know, like if I was a citizen, if I would just, I don't want to say trust, but you know, there's this thing, something not so true about that, I guess. So I think then we start to talk about how, and I cannot actually tell that there is this debate going on in Turkey about like activists and journalists. Sometimes we talk to each other, but it is not a public debate, I guess, just because we have more important or serious issues that we are trying to deal with that. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic. So I feel also happy to discuss this thing here with you guys, because as I said, normally we just talk about how many people are in jail, how are we going to survive this period of time in Turkey as the journalists. So I'm again so glad to be here. Then I can answer some of the questions.
Thank you. So yes, I'm going to turn to Basharat, and in your own work, in your New York Times or in your knowledge about different conflicts around the world, how do you think that interaction goes between activism and journalism?
Look, I mean, there's, sorry, can you? No. Oh, okay. Yeah. So, I guess I'll just hold this. I think it's an old question, really. I mean, it has. I mean, if you go back and look at the kind of think back on the context of the American Civil Rights Movement. I mean, one of my old teachers, Todd Gitlin, had a famous book called "The World Is Watching." It was at that time too, people who were young reporters, say for the Times or for various other papers from the kind of coastal cities, especially from New York and other places, who were going into the kind of Jim Crow America, who were going with the freedom marchers. I don't think, they really ever, I mean, that myth of this very question essentially comes from that idea that journalists are, that whole journalistic idea of objectivity, that there would be always a sense of balance and distance from things that we write about. And there are times, we kind of delude ourselves into ideas of fake balance, or actually believing that, we can have kind of a Herculean distance from things that affect our lives and our societies. I don't really believe in that, but I think the key difference to me as a practicing journalist in the role, and I have friends and close friends who are passionate activists of various causes, there would be, and I think a key difference would be that an activist has and in practice, especially now with social media and Twitter, they have the relative kind of freedom to, you can posture, you can be strident, you can shout as loud as you would like to, but that's not the tone. I might actually want the same things as a journalist or as a writer, but I think there's, whether it's you look at the Human Rights Watch or the Amnesty International, report after report, and there are various groups who work on the ground who would raise these voices. So I think they have a certain flexibility in terms of the tone and tenor, which they can adopt. Like, an activist friend of mine can actually take a particular example and, just in India, I just came from Delhi, where I'm based for the Times right now, and there's been a big debate. I mean, actually, the entire country is right now, in the last 4 years, with the rise of kind of majoritarian politics under Mr. Modi, there was a really sad case of a very young girl, 8-year-old child in Jammu and Kashmir, where I'm from, who was, kidnapped and raped and murdered by a bunch of goons, who then tapped into kind of broader Hindu nationalist politics and got support from that. And now, when you look at the responses to this particular tragedy, so it blurs. Like, I really don't see at this moment, most journalists are saying exactly the same thing as most activists are saying. But there's still, as a journalist, my first instinct would be, an activist would go and say, we should be ashamed, culprits should be, brought to book, they should be put on trial, speedy justice. But as a reporter, my first instinct would be to, I think, all those calls for action really, to use this case as an example, rode on the very fact that, a reporter with the Indian Express, Muzammil Jalil, a friend of mine, who actually did the legwork, found the facts, got hold of the charge sheet, which detailed in rather gruesome detail that particular act. And then you can have debates and conversations around that. So I think one key emphasis for us as journalists is to not just, look, people can be outraged about what I find or the work I do, but my primary responsibility and reaction is not outrage, is to do the careful, meticulous work of reporting, of finding things out, of analyzing things. And then, with the world we live in, from Twitter to Instagram to Facebook, now everything, there is an access of outrage. It's just that the world is terrible right now. But I think, we do have, so that's for me the key difference. And although I do qualify my sentence, because there are certain kinds of activists who go into the role of researchers. Say a researcher working on the Syrian prisons for the Human Rights Watch, or at Goldsmith, Eyal Weizman and his forensic architecture people, they worked with Amnesty on recreation of these horrific prisons that Assad ran and the tortures. That's also, you can also think of that as extraordinary journalism. Now, those are people that we at the Times are also talking to about reconstructing events, of using various technologies that are available to us beyond just a report in a newspaper. Because one of the things that the web has allowed us to do is you can, there's a virtual reality film that you could make as part of documentation, and you can use graphic design and you can use animation. But I think the core difference would be that from the journalistic perspective, it is the primary focus would be on being as careful in terms of gathering of that material as possible, to be accurate, to be fair, to be meticulous in that. So I think there's a certain value to that, especially now, because look, even if you think of yourself as being on the right side of history in this current moment, there is too much talk, and there's a lot that we can't be sure of. So so the work is in a way to also to produce a report and to curate things that you might be able to trust.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. That's another thought-provoking answer in thinking about the different layers of this. So I'm wondering, Francis, in your research and in the context of Hong Kong and China, what's your take on this?
Well, I guess on this general question of the relationship between activism and journalism, the first very simple and straightforward and very general answer is obviously, I would say activism always goes together with some kind of activism facilitating journalism, let me put it that way. It's hard to have one without the other. Now, of course, I'm using the term, kind of making up the term activism facilitating instead of using the word promoting, okay, because I think, there can be a lot of different kinds of journalism that's doing this job of facilitating activism. You don't have to necessarily go to really a very truly activist form of journalism. Even, the conventional idea of professional journalism, as long as you do it professionally, you independently, you really, discover social problems, you really talk about it in depth, you talk about that and publicize that. It's already, that kind of facts, that kind of, important point of views, etc., are already materials that are, facilitating different kinds of activism that can exist in a civil society. So basically, and I think, in all contexts, it's the same. Now, of course, But if we go deeper, and then talk about how actually in specific contexts, how journalism or professional journalism interacts with activism, then it's really historicized. I mean, you really need to historicize the whole thing. Even in Hong Kong and mainland China, they are very different. In Hong Kong, you have a strong, tradition of professional, quote-unquote, professional journalism in a mode of, emphasizing objectivity, neutrality, that kind of thing developed in the 1980s. And not because, Hong Kong people somehow like that idea, but because, as we all know, in journalism studies always say that the formation of journalistic norms has its own social historical context. It was in the context of the 1980s, right after the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but before the actual handover, where neither Britain nor China really had total control on Hong Kong. Then you had actually the breathing space for journalists to do their work. And in that particular context, those kinds of idea of neutrality, objectivity seem to make sense. Okay, but over time, okay, more and more journalists, especially after the handover, more and more journalists figure out that, well, actually, they don't make sense anymore. Okay, when you are talking about no longer you have two masters balancing each other, when you are talking about you have just one master and also a very strong state, okay, who is always trying to clamp down on freedom. Then over time, journalists really more and more realize that they actually have an affinity with social movements. Okay, you cannot avoid that. Now, there are still conflicts and tensions between quote-unquote journalism and activism, as actually I think Bashar has already talked about that. A lot of professional journalists, even these days in Hong Kong, they still sometimes feel like, well, our primary allegiance is after all to truth, to facts. Right? Sometimes they feel like some activists, of course not all, but some activists would rather just put truth aside as long as it serves their agenda. At least there is the perception there. Okay, so it might or might not be fair, but at least this kind of tension can go on. But as I said, rather, if you look at mainland China, it would be a somewhat different history. They don't have that history of so-called professional journalism, but they have the history of, in Chinese history, they have the history of journalists being an intellectual. The Chinese kind of intellectual, loving your country, being a member of the selected few educated people who has the vision or mission of educating the mass, leading the country to move forward, things like that. So, there arise in the 1980s and 1990s, there arise another kind of critical journalists, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, with a bit of commercialization of the media, a bit of reform, a bit of liberty, limited amount of freedom under the regime of Hu Jintao. Okay, there were investigative journalists, there were actually activist journalists, belonged to NGO, etc., which did a lot of very, very interesting work and very, very important work. So again, the interaction is really a very historicized thing. But ultimately, that's also the final point, is ultimately they share the same fate. Right? That's also because, after all, especially I think in authoritarian contexts, there are logics why they are, have this kind of affinity with each other. So there are also logics why ultimately they share the same fate. When the state, actually clamps down on journalism or on activism, they actually clamps down on both, right? Because you cannot kill activism without killing independent journalism. Okay, so I guess for example, in mainland China, I just mentioned 10 years ago you had a very limited degree of freedom, but actually there were journalists doing the job. I had friends working in the mainland Chinese official media, supposedly official media, but they were doing investigative work. Normally they could publish half of their products, because half of their products would not go through the censorship system. Okay, but they would try. They would try to push the boundary, right? That's why they were willing to do everything. And just test, okay, and then submit to the censorship system. If this story no, okay, then try again next time, right? So, for example, the most recent research about investigative journalism in China has shown that the number of investigative journalists, identifiable investigative journalists, has shrunk by half over a period of 7 years. Of course, there was a very big change in how the country is governed between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping best signified by how the Constitution was revised last month, right? But anyway, but that is the basic idea that I want to convey. I mean, ultimately, independent journalism and activism, especially in authoritarian contexts, they share the same fate.
Okay, thank you very much. And now let's go over to Skype and listen Anjan's take on this discussion.
Thank you, Omar. I'd first like to thank Pierre for inviting me to the conference. Thank you. I think it's a very important gathering, and my apologies again that I could not be there today. A little bit about my work. My work has primarily been in Central Africa, in Congo, Rwanda, and the Central African Republic. And my experience as a journalist has primarily been as a wire reporter. That's where I was trained as a journalist in Congo, working for the Associated Press. And then as a journalism instructor in Rwanda, where I witnessed and wrote about the destruction of the free press in Rwanda. And I tell the story of the destruction of the free press and the independent media through the lives of my students and colleagues who were imprisoned, tortured, killed, forced to flee the country. So my understanding of journalism and activism come very much from those two experiences and from reporting on the conflict that's still ongoing in the Central African Republic. I'd like to make a couple of contributions, or like to offer a couple of contributions to the discussion we're having. The first is to offer a definition of journalism. The way I see journalism as the primary function of journalism is holding power accountable. And I think inherent in that definition is an activist bent of mind. After the media, the free press was destroyed in Rwanda, the media and journalists who were still writing or broadcasting still performed the functions of informing the population about government policies or what things that the government was saying, for example, and entertainment, but sports, music, that kind of thing. But they were no longer performing the function of holding power accountable. They were no longer reporting on abuses of power by the government. They were no longer serving as a check on the government's and the executive's authority. And therefore, for me, they were no longer functioning as a media. They were no longer performing the role that journalists need to perform. I remember it was quite funny when I was, or tragic, when I was teaching my students, Rwandan students. I would read from random newspapers. I would read political articles, and almost in every case, the journalists were able to name the newspaper and even sometimes the journalist who authored the article. But when I read sports pieces or entertainment pieces, music or lifestyle, nobody had a clue which magazine or newspaper I was reading from. I think it's very telling, particularly in political journalism, how the activist bent of mind that journalists take. Not necessarily in the tone. And as a wire reporter, I was trained in objectivity, and the number of times, for example, I've had to report, I've gone into a place where government forces or militia have massacred people. But despite the weight of the evidence, as a wire reporter, I'm still held to be some kind of standard of objectivity. I need to say the government forces allegedly conducted a massacre when it's totally clear that they were responsible. I'm still held to this somewhat ridiculous, I find, standard to say that they were only allegedly responsible. Despite that, I think in our choice of subject, in the choice of topics that we report on as journalists, we take on a very important activist role in serving as a voice for the population and serving as a check on power. The second sort of contribution that I'd like to offer is to point out that among this community of journalists, activists, those who practice the written word, those who trade in the written word, are particularly on the front lines and particularly vulnerable to violence, to repression. This has been true from, in the Soviet Union, or prior to that with the samizdat journals in underground pamphlets in the Soviet Union, or in Russia before that, to the Arab Spring, as we mentioned, sort of social media, which used also the written word in social media. And the written word has this power in that it can maintain some kind of anonymity, which radio and TV offer less. Radio and TV often require antennas. They often can be identified, the speakers, and so they're often used by governments to advance propaganda, to inform populations on government actions. But the written word has this special status in that it is difficult to track down the source of some words. Even if that source is tracked down, the words can be copied quite easily and disseminated, whether on social media or by photocopying or by copying by hand. And so these are the two things that I'd like to offer to this conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anjan. So I think we can kind of distinguish different factors that, on the one hand, it seems there is a consensus that it is difficult to distinguish between journalism and activism, but because there are certain tensions between the two roles. In the sense, we heard that from Sharat, the idea that there are standards for journalism, that activists may be freer to produce discourse that journalists cannot, but at the same time, they share the same fate. So there's also the notion of digital media and social media and how that is changing the picture. The idea of context and history. If we're talking about journalism in China, what does that journalism look? What normative values does journalism have that may change the picture than, for instance, in Turkey or in Zimbabwe? Political system, a lot of the contexts we discussed are perhaps authoritarian contexts more than democratic contexts. But from all of this picture, perhaps I'll pick on one variable before I open it up to your questions, which is emotion as well, because I think that the idea of emotion perhaps doesn't get talked about as much as the other factors that we think about. So we heard, Burcu, you were saying, for instance, what if your friends are the ones who are in jail? What kind of labor does journalism and activism become? Or obviously, in circumstances of extreme violence, journalists or activists are also human beings at the end of the day. So I'll start with you, Shepard. In terms, what do you think the role of emotion in basically activist roles and also journalistic roles, specifically in extreme cases such as the one you were talking about?
I'd like to view a journalist as somebody who is not dispassionate about the issues they're discussing, somebody who is not, the myths that we teach at university that as a journalist you're supposed to be fair, you're supposed to be objective, you're supposed to be balanced, And to a certain extent, it makes you dispassionate about things that you're actually supposed to be passionate about. And once you're passionate about something, I think it's easier and more plausible to put your point across effectively, And therefore, my challenge with my project or my view of journalism, specifically in Zimbabwe and to a certain extent in other developing nations, is these differences of variables in journalism that, it's almost like pornography. We cannot, everyone has their own definition of what it is, but we know when we see it, right? So the type of journalism that you have in the global north is not the same as that one that you have in the global south. And those kinds of differences also inform your emotional attachment to issues that you're talking about. How do you, as a victim, for instance, write about the plight of your people in a dispassionate manner, in an objective manner, in a detached manner? That is impossible. And also, in terms of activism again, in the global south, you find that activism, in some cases, these NGOs that are sponsored by Western donors, they tend to sort of have what we call a crisis industry, where if we do not expose this crisis or we do not deal with this crisis, we're not going to get funding, you know. And to a certain extent, we don't want this crisis to be over, because once the crisis is over, what happens? Funding doesn't come anymore, you know. So to a certain extent, as the first keynote speaker said on the first day, that sometimes we need the West to leave us alone so that we deal with our own issues. And we can deal with our issues emotionally so until we find solutions to these things. But emotions play an important role in that.
Okay, so I'll move to Burcu, and perhaps Turkey is a case that complicates the global. It is emotional, but in terms of also the global South and global North, I don't know, it makes it more complicated. What do you think?
I mean, of course, we are human beings, and we have, I mean, I just gave this example of our jailed colleagues. But I mean, maybe also we should make a difference. I should also make this point here. So in Turkey, we have these definitions: yandaş medya, muhalif medya. Yandaş means like pro-government. Muhalif means the critical, I can say. So I don't know what a critical journalism means, because if you're a journalist, you should be critical anyway. So I mean, if you are working for a pro-government media, this actually, I mean, VCP, what you are doing, it's not an act of journalism. And so if we are talking about journalism, let me give you this example. So like there has been a systematic attack on the women's rights in Turkey for a while now. And as a woman, every time I read something, you know, I feel also like this attack is also on me. And as you can see from everything is purple, I'm a feminist journalist. So, I mean, so like, of course, you just show your side when you choose your topic, you know, to cover. So, of course, I covered the women's issues in Turkey now for not so long, but since I began covering these issues. So, okay, let's say I'm going to write an article about the women's rights, and I'm going to, of course, talk to this women NGOs in Turkey. And then, but if I'm going to, I mean, if there's something that I have to confirm, like if there's a claim and if I have to fact check, then I also have to, of course, call the officials. So, you know, you may, I mean, this is like the basic rule of journalism. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm not familiar with every country in the world, but I'm just, of course, talking with the case of Turkey. Sometimes we don't even, I see that we see some friends, they don't even need to do that. I mean, you know, you may call an official, and he or she may not want to answer your question, but you have to call them anyway, just, you know, to ask, you know, one question. And then you can include that in your story, saying that, you know, we have reached the officials, but they didn't choose to comment. This is something. So, you know, I mean, of course, you can just cover the topics that you want, and that's what actually, of course, the journalists do. And while I was just making some research about for this panel, I came up with an article in the Huffington Post and saying that, you know, people are more likely to share things about which they feel a strong emotional connection. So which is also actually true for the journalists too. And then, but then also, of course, then there was this journalism facts and the neutral presentation of those facts. I don't know what neutral, but I mean, of course, I mean, I know, but at least you have to be balanced. I mean, you already show your side, you know, when you're, as I when you're choosing, but we can be at least, I think, be more balanced by trying to fact check, because I think this is also something also new for us, that, you know, with this with the social media and the internet. Sometimes when we see something on the internet, we automatically think that that may be true, but I mean, of course, you have to fact check anyway as a journalist. So, you know, when I'm going to finish, but when I talk about this yandaş media and muhalif media, like we also see sometimes in Turkey, there's a misunderstanding about the act of journalism. We see some people, they're trying to just damage the image of the government by making false news. I mean, it's not the way that it should be. And I'm also saying this as an independent journalist. I mean, you know. So there are some, I mean, I don't know, I think these are the issues that should be debated, but we are not at that point, at least in Turkey now.
Okay, so Shahd, what do you think in your work as well? You talked about the differences between the labor that journalists should do.
Sure.
And and activists, but how is that, is it so easy in practice as much as it is on paper to make that distinction, especially when it's conflict, when there are a lot of emotions at stake?
I mean, we are nothing without the emotion. I mean, apart from a particular job that I do right now, I mean, I became a journalist out of a sense of rage and injury. I grew up in Kashmir, and in the early 90s, when the rebellion started there and the insurgency started, and there was a brutal crackdown, I was in high school. I was a teenager, and that was my journalism school. I mean, that was, apart from the degrees one gets or the universities, there's a famous saying in journalism, a lot of people say that what's very important is what you find. That is true, but what you find is also what you carry within you. I would not delude myself thinking that, our formative experiences and the worlds we come from. You could send the same white person to Oxford to the same degree and send the same brown person and the black person there and ask them to write about the same subject, and the 3 essays will be very different. The histories, the legacies that we carry, they inform the choices we make. They even inform readings of the same text. But I think that question of emotion and how it motivates us to produce work or do a certain kind of work, it's not limited to a certain form of journalism. I mean, or a certain kind of, whether it's, Anjan, a dear friend of mine, I mean, I know his work very well. I'm also his editor every now and then. I mean, I know why he writes a certain kind of book. And it's very personal. His book, Bad News, it's not, it's the same texture. I mean, the questions he would have been confronting there, these are people you're close to. I mean, when I was writing my first book, which was about the war in Kashmir, Curfew Night, I mean, there was a scene I had to write about my father surviving a landmine blast. There's a scene you had to write about when I was about to be tortured. I was in a cell, and there was a soldier putting a gun to my head. Now, you can, breastbeat and wail, or you can remind yourself that atrocity and political injustice is one of the oldest stories, and great works of literature and writing have been produced over the years. I mean, people have, I mean, ultimately, what are we writing about? These are themes that are very old. And this has been written about, from David and Goliath, Karbala, Mahabharata onwards. There's a lot. So at times, I think, we kind of forget the broader picture, that we don't exist in isolation. The world did not start with Zuckerberg. So, yes, I mean, this is very much part of anyone who writes. Mm-hmm. And I also think that, in the world, journalism is not just the news reporter for The Guardian or the New York Times. Mm. It's also the LRB. It's also the op-ed pages of the Daily Nation in Kenya. It's also a small magazine in India or in Bangladesh. But there's also the forms in which, there's documentary filmmakers who have done extraordinary work. Mm-hmm. And so I think, fundamentally, a sense of a political emotion is an important thing in the production of this work. If you're not moved by it, you don't expect anyone else to be moved by it.
Okay.
I mean, why would I expect anyone to care about an essay or a story that I publish if, I don't have this hope that maybe this will move them. They might be disturbed for a few minutes. So I think, that has an important role in the work, whether it's in the form of a newspaper article or a book or a film.
Thank you. And Francis, is that a variable you look at? And please, if you could keep it brief so we open it up.
Sure. I think my comments will be brief. I think, Well, let me put it this way. Okay, so when we talk about emotion, so obviously, you can say, one can say that there is actually this clear distinction between, activism and journalists. They talk differently, right? If you're an activist, you're leading a parade, a protest, you are supposed to shout, right? I mean, you are supposed to really show your emotion, really, mobilize people, right? When you're a journalist, you never shout, or the general idea is that you are not supposed to, right? But at the same time, I would also say that if you actually look at journalism itself, it's actually very complicated. It is not without emotion. There must be. It's not about political journalism. It's all journalism. I mean, you report a disaster, earthquake, okay, versus you report your national team winning the World Cup. You're not supposed to give the same facial expression, right? That's impossible, right? Okay, because that's just part of being appropriate, okay? But also, interestingly, being very controlled, right? That's the idea of professional journalism. Also, it's complicated because you write a hard news story. It's somewhat different from you write a 2,000-word feature story, right? You have a little bit more leeway. At least in traditionally speaking, conventionally, you have a little bit more leeway to demonstrate emotion or to write a little bit, a piece with stronger affect when you write so-called soft news, right? Or think about photojournalism, right? A lot of photos. You think about the most famous photos in journalism history. All of them are very strong, arouse very strong emotional reactions, right? So it's not as if professional journalism is totally against emotion, but there is a sense of, you have to control it in some way, right? But then it raises the complex question of then how far should we go or how far can we go, right? So where do you exactly draw the line? And that becomes actually a very murky question, and that's always under negotiation in specific contexts, I would say.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. And I'll go to Anjan for the final words, and please, if you could also keep it a bit brief. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I'll mostly echo Basharat's very moving intervention, which resonates very strongly with me. Emotions at the center of what I do. It's at the center of the subjects I choose, the stories I write. Often when I'm writing a book, for example, when I'm structuring the book, I will begin by writing out the scenes in which I was most moved, that I found greatest emotion, because I know that this will communicate a certain emotion to whoever I'm writing for, and these form the sort of nerves of the book. And I think even the approach of writing for me lays out or emphasizes the centrality of emotion to my work. In my Rwanda book, I wasn't planning to write at all. I was in Rwanda to sort of write another book about Congo. The only reason I began to write about Rwanda was because the journalists I was teaching, my colleagues, began to be attacked. These are close friends of mine, people I cared about. And so that became the motivation to write the book in the first place. And even in the act of writing itself, I found I was writing in Rwanda, very repressive dictatorship regime. And I found while I was writing this book about these brave journalists in that country, I found it quite difficult to describe what had happened to them, because all around me, I was surrounded by propaganda. Every line I wrote, I had a million voices in my head telling me the opposite, telling me the government's line. And I found it very difficult to break through that in my head. And I found the only way I could do it was to step back and ask myself, for whom am I writing this? Why am I writing this? And it wasn't to react to the government's repression. It was rather out of a sense of affection for these journalists, for these colleagues. They were the people who I was writing this for. Their work I didn't want to be forgotten. And I wanted to put their work on the record and their brave stories. And so that was really the motivation. So emotion, you can see from the conception all the way to the writing, runs across the creation of journalism or my work. And I guess to Basharat's point about form, I think any medium that carries emotion could become a form of journalism, poetry, art. And as journalism curricula decolonized around the world, I think we will come to have a much broader sense of what journalism is. In the Middle East, for example, there's a great tradition of poetry. And as long as the poetry, emotion in the poetry is received and heard by the population and can hold power accountable, that too can become journalism.